Smoke. 10 small fires in a clearing just after dark. 10 people sit around them. That's the whole village. Watch them, because by the end of this, you'll understand more about your own life from watching theirs. Tonight, nothing happens. Children sleep. A woman mends a torn hide. A man sharpens a spear point he won't need for weeks. An old man stares at the fire like he's done 10,000 times before. Ordinary. Forgettable. The kind of night that doesn't make it into any story because nothing in it seems worth telling. But play it forward. Years forward. Decades. 5 of these 10 people will be dead before they're 5 years old. Not eventually, soon. The other 5, the ones you'd expect to be the lucky half, aren't lucky in some small way. They're going to live full, long lives. 60 years, 70. Lives you'd recognize as complete by any modern measure. Now, do the math the way history textbooks do it. Average all 10 lifespans together. 36. That's the number. That's Stone Age life expectancy. Memorize it because you've probably heard it quoted 100 times. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Nobody in that village died at 36. Not one person. Half of them never got near it. The other half blew straight past it into real old age. 36 isn't a life, it's a ghost. A number built from the gap between 2 completely different fates, describing the actual experience of exactly 0 human beings. So what is 30 really measuring? Not how long people lived, how violently childhood could end before it began. Except that raises a darker question. How catastrophic does childhood have to be to drag a number that low? We'll get there. But first, a cave, a man, and something that shouldn't be possible. Iraq, a cave called Shanidar, 50,000 years ago. An old man is dying. Old by any standard, ancient or modern. His right arm ends just below the elbow. Amputated, decades earlier. The bone healed clean around the stump, which means he didn't die from it. He lived with it, hunted with it, ate with it. For years afterward, one eye socket is crushed from an old skull fracture. That eye has been blind for years. His hearing is mostly gone, the bone around his ear canals showing the kind of growth that comes from decades of damage, not a single accident. Arthritis runs through nearly every joint in his body, the kind that comes from a lifetime, not a season. Ask the only question that matters here. How does a one-armed, half-blind, hard-of-hearing man survive an ice age? He can't track game alone. He can't see a predator approaching from his blind side. He can't hear it either. By every rule the everyone died young and brutally version of prehistory wants you to believe, this man should have died decades before the body anthropologists eventually found. He doesn't die that way. Not alone, and not early. Somebody hunted for him. Somebody walked beside the side he couldn't see from year after year. Somebody, every single day for 15 or 20 years, decided this man was worth the food he ate and the pace he slowed the group down to. That's the headline, not the wound, the care. This is Shanidar one. And his bones are 40,000-year-old proof that old age, disability, and the people who looked after both already existed deep in the Ice Age. Long before farms, long before cities, long before anything you'd call civilization. A man this broken, kept alive this long, by people who had no obligation to do it, and did it anyway. So old age wasn't rare, which means something else was doing the killing. And it was killing almost entirely the people who never got the chance to become old at all. Picture a single spark falling into dry scrubland. It catches. It burns through whatever's nearby. Fast. Ugly. Then it runs out of fuel. No trees close enough to jump to. The fire dies alone, in the middle of nowhere. And the scrubland barely remembers it happened. That's a disease landing inside a hunter-gatherer band. 30 people. 40. Scattered. Always moving. Days from the next group. A virus catches, burns through a few bodies, and then starves. No new hosts close enough to keep it alive. The infected either recover or don't. And either way, the chain ends there, because there's nowhere else for it to go. Now drop that same spark into a city. Thousands of people stacked floor to ceiling, sharing water, sharing waste, sharing the animals living in their own yards. Animals that, unlike the wild game a hunter brings down once and butchers, are touched every single day. Milked, herded, slept beside. That's not scrubland anymore. That's a woodpile, built from the ground to the rafters. And once it catches, it doesn't go out in 5 days. It burns for generations, jumping house to house, season to season. occasionally erupting into the kind of citywide catastrophe no hunter-gatherer band could have ever produced, simply because no hunter-gatherer band was ever large enough to fuel one. Smallpox, measles, plague. None of them could survive in the scattered world hunter-gatherers actually lived in. They needed the woodpile. We built it for them. One granary and one crowded street at a time. Here's the sentence that should rearrange something in your head. Civilization didn't rescue us from disease. In a very real sense, civilization invented it. And the bones agree without hesitation. Compare a hunter-gatherer's skeleton to a farmer's from the very village that replaced the foragers who lived there first. The farmer is shorter, worse teeth, more skeletal stress. And in site after site, the children are dying at higher rates, not lower. There's a name for this uncomfortable fact: the Neolithic mortality crisis. The greatest medical disaster in human history may not have been a war or a plague that arrived from outside. It may have been the decision to settle down at all, but disease isn't the worst of it. The worst of it happens at birth. Picture one woman, not a statistic, her. Give her a name in your head if it helps. She's young, healthy, exactly the kind of person you'd bet on surviving anything. She'll give birth 8 times across her life. Ordinary, for her time. Children were labor, were security, were the only retirement plan that existed. Each birth carries something like a 1 in 100 chance of killing her. Hemorrhage, infection, a labor that simply can't finish without tools that don't exist yet. A position the baby won't shift out of no matter how many hours pass. 1 in 100 sounds almost safe. You'd take that bet on almost anything else in life without blinking. Run it 8 times. By her 8th birth, her lifetime odds of dying from childbirth have climbed past 1 in 15. In some populations, past 1 in 12. That's not a number anymore. That's one woman out of every dozen you've ever known, gone. Not from age, not from chance illness, but specifically because she had children and did it enough times that the odds eventually caught her. Somewhere, a husband is suddenly raising children alone. Somewhere, an infant is being nursed by another mother in the group because the one who carried it didn't survive the carrying. And on the other side of that same event, every time, the infant. Across most of human history, somewhere between 3 and 5 children out of every 10 died before becoming adults. Most of them inside their first year or 2 of life. Birth complications nobody could see coming. Infections an immature immune system had no defense against. Hunger in the lean months when there simply wasn't enough food to go around, and the smallest bodies were the first to suffer for it. Here's the line that should permanently change how you read the number 30. Ancient humans didn't mostly die young. Millions of them never got the chance to grow old, or die young. They never got the chance to become people at all. The 30-year myth takes that, the single largest tragedy in this entire story, and quietly mislabels it as evidence that adults aged fast. It isn't the same story. It isn't even the same kind of sad. There's a third killer, and even the experts argue about its size. Skeletal trauma at some prehistoric sites suggests violent death. Conflict between groups accounted for as much as 1 in 5 adult male deaths. Other researchers push back hard on numbers that high. Here's what's actually true once you stop staring at one site and look at dozens. Some ancient populations show almost no violence at all. Others show plenty. The difference isn't primitive people were savage. It tracks something colder, crowding, hunger, scarcity. Squeeze a population and the violence appears. Give it room and food, and mostly it doesn't. Think about what that actually means. The same species, the same biology, behaving completely differently depending on whether there's enough to go around. Violence wasn't human nature switched on. It was a pressure valve. And for most of prehistory, in most places, that valve simply wasn't under enough pressure to blow. There's a funeral worth picturing here too, because it tells you something the trauma statistics can't. At several ancient burial sites, archaeologists have found something they didn't expect from a species supposedly too brutal to spare the resources. Graves with offerings, flowers in pollen traces laid deliberately around a body, tools placed beside the dead that the living clearly couldn't afford to lose, and gave up anyway. A society constantly at war with itself doesn't bury its dead like that. A society that grieves does. Now picture something smaller, something that happens in seconds. A hunter is skinning a deer. His knife slips. A shallow cut, barely worth mentioning, across his palm. He wraps it in a strip of hide and keeps working because there's still meat to carry home before dark. The next morning, it's fine. A little sore, Nothing. 2 days later, the skin around it is hot to the touch, and the soreness has spread up his wrist. 4 days later, he can't lift the arm, and the heat has become a fever that won't break. 6 days later, he's dead. His family buries him beside people who died from spears, from childbirth, from fevers with no name, and his death looks, on a skeleton centuries later, almost identical to all of them. Just a man, just a wound, just bad luck as far as the bones can tell. A cut. That's all it took. Today, that same cut costs you a $10 prescription and a story to tell at dinner. For nearly the entire history of our species, it was a death sentence, with no warning label, no countdown anyone could see coming until it was already too late to stop. Antibiotics didn't just cure diseases. They quietly disarmed almost every other category we've just walked through. The wound, the birth, the infection that follows the violence. The gap between ancient mortality and modern mortality was never about ancient bodies being weaker. It was about threats that have always existed, waiting for tools that for most of human history simply hadn't been invented yet. And here's where the story turns one more time. Because the bones themselves had been keeping a secret, aging a skeleton relies on things like worn teeth and fused bone. And it works fine, right up until someone gets old. Past 50 or so, a 45-year-old skeleton and a 65-year-old skeleton can look almost identical. So for decades, scientists did the easy thing. Anyone past 50 just got filed as old. No further guessing. Case closed. That sounds harmless. It wasn't. If a population actually had plenty of people living into their 60s, 70s, 80s, but the method could only ever say 50 plus, then every life expectancy number built from that data was quietly erasing its own elderly. Not because those people never existed, because the method couldn't see them. There's a site in Ohio called Libin that proves this happened in real life, not just in theory. The first analysis said almost nobody made it past their 40s or 50s, a population on paper that looked exactly like the myth predicts. Decades passed. Other researchers picked up where the first analysis left off and went back to the exact same bones, with sharper methods. Finer measurements of bone density, better calibration for how joints wear with decades of use, not just years, and a meaningful share of the people dumped into that vague old pile turned out to have lived far longer than anyone had given them credit for. The bones never changed, the blind spot did. It's worth sitting with how unsettling that should be. An entire generation of textbooks, documentaries, and casual dinner party trivia was built on numbers that were never measuring what they claimed to measure. Not because anyone lied, but because nobody had yet built a method precise enough to see the truth sitting right there in the dirt. Once you stop relying on bones at all, once you can simply ask a living population how old its elders actually are, the picture stops being blurry. Researchers studying the Hadza, the Ache, the Hiwi, and other present-day hunter-gatherer groups found something almost eerie in how consistent it was. Across every population they checked, the single most common age at which an adult actually died wasn't 30, wasn't 40. It clustered at 70 to 72. Go back to the village. 5 gone before 5 years old. 5 living to 70. That wasn't a simplified story for a thought experiment, dressed up to make a statistic easier to swallow. That is, almost exactly, the real shape of the past, measured now, not by guessing at bones, but by simply watching living people grow old in front of researchers' eyes, generation after generation, group after group, continent after continent, with the same number turning up again and again, like it's been waiting the whole time to be noticed, which leaves one question nobody's answered yet. Why would a species evolve to keep so many people alive decades past the point where they could have any more children? There's an answer, and it's strange enough to sound invented. The grandmother hypothesis. Picture the same young mother from earlier, the one whose odds eventually caught up with her after enough births. Now picture her own mother, decades past childbearing herself, still alive, still strong enough to carry a toddler on her hip while the younger woman gathers food, nurses an infant, recovers from a birth that nearly killed her. That older woman isn't a guest in this family's survival. She's load-bearing. Women who lived well past their reproductive years weren't an accident. They were doing something valuable enough for their grandchildren's survival. Childcare, food, decades of accumulated knowledge. That evolution actively built for it. Humans are almost alone on this planet in doing this at all. Most species, once reproduction ends, simply don't have much evolutionary reason to keep running. We're one of the rare exceptions, and the reason is sitting right there holding the baby. And here's the trap the 30-year myth walks straight into without noticing. Evolution doesn't build elaborate machinery for a stage of life that almost never happens. If people really dropped dead at 30, there'd be no grandmothers around long enough for evolution to notice them, let alone shape around them. The fact that an entire evolutionary theory exists to explain why grandmothers live so long is itself the proof. Grandmothers living long wasn't rare. It was common enough for long enough to build what a human being is. Go back to the cave in Iraq. The one-armed man, fed and guided for 20 years by people who, by the myth's own logic, should already have been dead themselves. He wasn't an exception the history books forgot to mention. He was the rule, written into a single skeleton. So why does everyone died at 30 survive, when nearly everything we've just walked through points somewhere else? Because it's comfortable. It lets the present feel like the hero of its own story, a short, brutal past rescued by a shining modern world. It flatters every generation that repeats it because it makes simply being alive today sound like an achievement, rather than the result of 1,000 small inherited improvements most people never think about. Comfortable. Clean. Just not true. The real version takes one more sentence to say. And it's more impressive than the myth it replaces. We didn't raise the ceiling on how long a human could live. The longest confirmed human life ever recorded, 122 years, stands alone as a record-keeping fluke, not proof biology shifted. Long lives into the 70s and 80s were always possible, written into Ice Age bones. Built into the grandmothers, our entire species was quietly designed around. There was never a version of humanity that couldn't get old. There was only ever a version of humanity that far too often never got the chance to try. What we actually did took thousands of years, and antibiotics, and clean water, and modern medicine to accomplish. And it was never about the ceiling. We raised the floor. We didn't make it possible to live longer. We made it far more likely you'd survive long enough to find out you already could. Go back to the 10 fires one last time. Watch them differently now. 5 of those people were never going to grow old. Not because their lives were short, but because they were never finished. And 5 of them were always going to make it all the way to 70, the way humans have for tens of thousands of years, in caves, on ice fields, around fires exactly like these. The number 30 was never describing a species that aged fast. It was describing a species that, for most of its existence, kept losing its members before they ever got the chance to find out how long they were built to last.